What's going on, guys, and welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. And of course, at long last, today we're talking The Undertaker one more round episode of Broken Skull Sessions with none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin. This show started exactly 1 year ago. I'm putting this episode up on Wednesday, but it aired for the very first time 1 year ago yesterday on Survivor Series Sunday 2019, with the very first guest being The Undertaker. And that was what kind of kicked off this run for Taker, where obviously at that point they were still filming the Broken Skull Sessions. They knew the end was near. And Taker even said on this episode that he thought the AJ Styles match would be his last. And so far it is, and we'll get to that momentarily. But that was really what kicked off him doing more interviews, coming out more in the open. And we've seen Taker out of character before, very rarely though. Whenever he was in WWE documentaries and specials and being interviewed and stuff, very rarely would we see him out of character. We have seen him a lot out of character, in the last year, to the point where he was doing fucking Hot Ones last week. And that was great, don't get me wrong, but I never expected to see The Undertaker on an episode of Hot Ones. And it's a great thing. And I knew after that first episode, I think that episode of Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold last year, Stone Cold and Taker, was actually one of the most watched videos they've ever had here on the channel. Maybe people thinking it was the actual episode of Broken Skull Sessions and not a review of it. But it's still something I think is pretty cool to this day. I don't think this video will do quite as well as that one, not even close. But that was a great episode of Taker on Broken Skull Sessions, if you haven't already seen it. Now, this is the continuation of that, and I thought it was a phenomenal conversation, no pun intended, with him being the Phenom and whatnot. I did say in that review, and I haven't listened back to my review in a long time, I did say in that video that there were a lot of things he didn't cover, and understandably so. He's had a very long career, obviously spanning 30 years. He's not going to be able to get to everything in an hour and a half, 2 hour conversation. I think that one was an hour and a half, maybe hour 45. This podcast was 2 hours long. So in reality, it's like a 4 hour long interview. And the guy probably has way more stories. I mean, in a 30-year career, you got to expect that he didn't even cover here. But he did cover all the things they didn't get to last time. They talk about the last ride, the final AJ Styles match, the final farewell, which obviously this was recorded before that, but it aired the same day as Survivor Series on Sunday. They get to a lot of different stuff. I even said in that first review, how could you not fucking mention Kane? I mean, they're so linked and so synonymous with one another. Kane, I don't even know if was mentioned once in that initial episode, but they get a lot into Kane on this episode. Almost a little too much because they get into stuff that I already heard recently. There's been so much Taker content, and if you've watched all of it like I have, there's a lot of stuff that's repeated from the Paul Bearer documentary, from the Brothers of Destruction documentary, from all these other various Taker interviews and stuff like that. A lot of stuff we've heard before, but it'll never not be fascinating to me to hear and see Taker in this type of environment. So overall, I thought this was outstanding and well worth the hype. Easily the best thing they put out on the network this month involving Taker, and that's saying something, because I thought the Paul Bearer documentary was great. I thought the Meeting the Undertaker special was great. Brothers of Destruction, WWE Untold, all very good specials, but this one tops them all. So the very first thing that Stone Cold asks Taker is, how you feeling, what you been up to? Taker says he's feeling good and been up to absolutely nothing, aside from doing all the interviews to promote Survivor Series and the last ride and whatnot in 2020. But other than that, he's been up to nothing, and he absolutely loves it. It's gotten easier for him to kind of talk about things. It was very weird at first, pulling back that curtain, but it's become more natural to him over the last year, having done it so much. And sometimes he does second-guess himself. There are times where he does second-guess himself and says, tells himself, should I really have shared that story? Should I really have done this? Should I really have started to pull back the curtain? And he kind of questions if he did the right thing in doing all these interviews and doing the documentary and being interviewed and stuff like that, appearing out of character as often as he has. But then he says to himself, you know what? I've done this for so long. It was my internal habit to protect everything that at this point, I stayed in kayfabe, I stayed in character for so long that there is going to come a time where I should share some stories, I should do interviews, and I should kind of be able to enjoy the luxuries of life without always staying in character. He did it for 30 years. I think it's safe to say it's okay that he's not doing it now. And people will always feel like, oh, we should have never opened a fucking Twitter account. Listen, I agree. And he even said if it was up to him, he would still, everyone, not even himself, but everyone would still be living in kayfabe. But being out of character creates more opportunities, and I completely agree. He gets to do more stuff business-wise, appear in movies and shows if he wanted to. I can only imagine how many more movies and shows this guy would have done had he, not stayed in character, had he gone out of character more often. But he didn't. He was always in character. Stone Cold shares off the One More Round poster they made with himself and Taker, which I thought was really cool. That would be awesome if they sold it. Maybe they do, but I thought that was really cool. So Taker says, and Austin asks him, are there times where you feel like Taker kind of bleeds over into Mark Calloway and you kind of get the two confused? Taker said he is mostly Mark Calloway. The way that he comes across, he is 90% most of the time himself. And he doesn't confuse the two at all. And they do cheers to an awesome career, which they do a lot of drinking on this episode, by the way, which should come as no surprise with it being an episode of Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin. But they drink Jack Daniels. I don't know if they drink the Taker wine, but they bring that out, actually. That was the next thing they discussed. Was Stone Cold makes a joke about Taker having his own fucking line of wine, which WWE legitimately produced. If you don't follow the product anymore, that is something they created. An Undertaker and a separate one for the Ultimate Warrior line of wine. Why? I don't know. I don't know how well it's sold. Maybe they saw Jericho as a little bit of the bubbly and they were like, oh, we got to get in on that. I don't know. But they do sell his own wine. Austin's like, how the fuck did this come about? And Taker's like, you know what? They asked me to do it essentially. And he didn't really give a full-on answer, but he was like, hey, they're creating more merch for me now, and this is kind of the luxuries that kind of come out of me not being in character still, which I thought was funny. He said that he was humbled to stay relevant for 30 years, and it feels like just yesterday that he began in the business. That debut went down on November 22nd, 1990. And obviously the entire first episode, a majority of that first episode a year ago, went into his upbringing and early days in the business and all that other type of stuff. So this is kind of like the extra stuff they didn't get to the first time, which is even better. But he does talk about the sacrifices that come with being in the business and how relationships are very difficult if you're a wrestler. And he has regrets, but he is blessed to be able to do what he loves. Like he says, the days that, I don't know how many kids he has. I know he has a daughter now with Michelle McCool, but I'm pretty sure he has other kids, if not at least one more kid, with his previous wives. I'm not exactly sure what that situation. I think he had at least he obviously had one previous wife. I'm not sure if he had multiple, but I think he has other kids. I don't know. Those are days that he'll never get back, but he is blessed to be able to do what he loves, and he's trying to make the most of the time that he has now to make up for that time from many years ago, at least to the best of his ability. And how commitment is what you have to have if you want to be able to make it on top. You have to be committed to this business. You have to be a part of this business. You have to live, breathe, and eat this business in order to be successful, and he was. And he was even consumed by the business while at home. Stone Cold Steve Austin was, Taker was, I'm sure a lot of people are and have been in the past because they want to be successful. There is no downtime. Your motor is always running, he said. Even when you're home, you're always kind of thinking about, okay, when can I pack? When can I go home? He doesn't even know what to do with himself. I mean, obviously now he does, but previously being in the business for 30 years, and obviously he hasn't been full-time in a long time, but for the first, I would say, 20 years or so, he never had any downtime aside from when he was hurt. So when he was home, he had no idea what to do with himself because he was always in pro wrestling mode. He was always thinking about, okay, I got to pack my shit, go to the next town, come home, do this stuff. He never really thought about his family or personal stuff. He was always in work mode. And he tried to make that work to the best of his ability. And he said, this business is too tough to just settle for being mediocre. That's not exactly what he said, but along those lines. In regards to, like, this business will consume you. You can't be in it just to be a mid-level guy. You have to want to be at the top, because if you're not, you're just wasting your time. So Stone Cold brings out, in addition to the Taker one, which I thought was funny again, he brings out a Taker custom-made WWE Championship belt. It's a Winged Eagle WWE title belt, but it has the colors and design that was made for Taker that he obviously never used on TV. I don't even think they sell this thing. I know they do sell a Taker title, I think on the website, and a Fiend title and shit like that. That's not what this is. This was a legit Taker title that they made for him to use, and he never did. And Taker's never seen it before, and I guess he's able to bring it home here, which is pretty cool. And Taker even admits that, they talk about the world championship and stuff like that, and what it takes to be a top guy, and how people, when they think of him, they don't think of him being a world champion. He was a 7-time world champion between winning the title for the first time in 91 up until he lost the World Heavyweight Championship in 2010. People don't look at Taker as being a world champion. And how we always felt that he was better in chase mode, which I agree. When he was champion, he had some decent runs, specifically that last one in 2010. He had some decent matches with CM Punk, Rey Mysterio, Batista, among others, but he was always better in chase mode. And whenever he was due to have an extended run, and he said for the reason, by the way, for that, and being better in chase mode, is that it's hard to do something with a monster babyface champion, which, again, I completely agree. You never really think about it. Like, for example, Braun Strowman, as the Universal Champion this year, a babyface monster world champion, just doesn't really work as well. Babyface in chase mode monster, that works, but finally winning the title and having an extended run doesn't work as well. And anytime that he was due for an extended run, he got hurt. So then they talk about the streak, and again, I'm not really sure how much of this they got into in the original episode, but obviously, and he even admits it here, no one ever really thought anything of the streak until he was 9-0, going into that Ric Flair match at WrestleMania 18. And I think Flair may have made a comment about it, although Taker was the heel, I believe. They rewatched the match. It's a very underrated match, not the best streak match by any means, but Taker really brought the best out of Ric Flair on that night, and it was a very good match, one of my favorites from the streak. I think it's a very underrated match from that WrestleMania and just from the streak in general. And he was thrilled to be in that match. Both of them were, but specifically Taker because he wanted to work with Flair. And that was the first time he made a reference to the streak, because after he won, he kind of puts up his fingers and does the 10. So that was the first time they really made reference to it. But yeah, before WrestleMania 18, Vince gave him a choice. Do you want to work with Ric Flair or Rob Van Dam? So Vince probably said, hey, do you want to work with Rob Van Dam or this guy Ric Flair? And Taker said before Vince could even finish saying Ric Flair, he said Ric, because he idolized him that much. I don't think they had a chance to work together during Flair's original run from 91 to early 93. I don't think so, because they were both... Flair was a heel. Taker, I think, was a heel for most of that. I mean, he turned face eventually, but I don't know if they ever had a match at that point. Maybe I'm wrong and they did, but I don't remember one. Maybe it was like a minor program. I don't remember. But they finally had the chance to work at WrestleMania 18, and it paid off. And Flair even thanked him afterward for restoring his confidence. And Flair talked about this in his own episode of Broken Skull Sessions a couple of months ago. But Taker never really understood what that meant, like why Flair felt that way, until Brock heard him at WrestleMania. Until that Brock match at WrestleMania 30, because after that he was like, wow, I should not be doing this anymore. His confidence was shot after WrestleMania 30, and he finally could relate to Ric Flair in that moment. So Stone Cold brings up various WrestleMania records, from his own to, I think, The Rock's and Hulk Hogan's and John Cena's. Taker's record, as it stands right now, is 25-2, with his only 2 losses coming against Roman Reigns and, of course, Brock Lesnar from 2014. And Austin even brings up, and I'm glad they talked about it here, they talk about the streak and how it ended and whatever. And they talk about it in the last episode, but they talk about it in more detail here because they have more time. So Taker... Stone Cold said this back then, but Taker confirmed here that he agreed to do Stone Cold's podcast, which was and still is on Podcast One, 6 years ago. Even before all of this ever happened, he was supposed to be in Stone Cold's podcast. And I remember, because I was listening to the show even then, Stone Cold said, oh yeah, I'm going to have Taker on in a couple weeks. He said he would come on, blah, blah, blah. But Taker agreed to come on before the streak ended. Then he got hurt. Then he was off the show. And there was this whole thing about, is he done, blah, blah, blah. So then it never really happened. But yeah, he was going to be on the show. Had maybe Taker won, we probably would have heard Taker out of character for the first time 5-6 years ago, which is really crazy to think about. But Taker confirms what he's already said, and he reiterates this, that he did not think Brock needed the win that night. And the finish changed throughout the day, from him winning to Brock winning. He arrived at the arena that day, and it was supposed to be him going over. And then it changed to Brock going over later on in the day. And he knew the moment that Vince walked in his locker room, which he never does. Usually Vince sends for someone to fetch Taker to bring him to his office if he wants to talk to him. He knew when he saw Vince pop up in his own locker room that shit was going down, that shit was getting changed. And Taker thought that, Vince even said, oh, if it's not Brock, then who is it? Taker said, well, if we don't know if it's not going to be Brock, then maybe we shouldn't end it. He thought that if Brock wasn't the right guy, then maybe we don't end it. If there is no one right guy to do it because he didn't think Brock was the right guy, then you just never end it. But he always thought there was a chance he could lose. In this business, you never really know. He figured he might, retire undefeated at WrestleMania, but he always knew there was a chance he could lose. But if it was his choice, and again, he said this elsewhere before, he would have had Roman Reigns be the one to break the streak if it was his choice, if it was Taker's choice. And Stone Cold even asks him, do you expect anything like the streak, resembling the streak, to ever happen again? And he says no. Nothing like the streak will ever happen again because it happened organically. They didn't even know it was a streak until like halfway through. Not until he was 10-0 that they realized that he was undefeated at the event. So it happened super organically. Something like that can just not be manufactured. And that's a long thing, too. That's a long-term booking thing. I mean, he went 21-0 for over 20 years. Nowadays, it's such a short-term attention span, like you'll never probably see that again, ever. Like, I mean, it could it happen? Yeah. Will it happen? No. But Austin agreed that it should not have ended, that he would not have ended the streak. And Taker even says here he felt like there was equity left in the streak, and that Reigns probably would have been the right guy to end it maybe like a year or two later, probably around WrestleMania 32 or 33, which is when he ended up facing him anyway. So they then transition from that to talking about Hell in the Cell. And they talk about the idea behind the structure and how it was designed to do two things. Prevent interference, because he was feuding with Shawn Michaels at the time. China was getting involved. Triple H was getting involved. The rest of DX, the early incarnation of DX. So having the cell would accomplish that in preventing them from interfering, but also set up the debut of Kane. The entire structure was designed to introduce Kane, which they had been teasing for most of the year in 1997. When Kane debuted, which we've heard a million stories about, but it was cool to hear it again, he calls it one of the most epic stare-downs in WWE history and one of the greatest stories ever told. Over the course of 23 years, they have told this story between Taker and Kane from 97 up until 2020. Kane was there at the final farewell on Sunday, so that does technically count. He calls Shawn Michaels, although he was a fucking prick at that point, he was ahead of his time with what he could do physically. And how Shawn Michaels is one of those few guys that he could have a great match with a fucking broomstick. So that dynamic worked perfectly. They rewatched the match, and Taker recalls working with Kane for the first time in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And again, they talk about this in the Brothers of Destruction recent documentary that came out, but they worked for the first time in Smoky Mountain, and he knew immediately, Taker did, that he wanted him in WWE. But the brother idea didn't come until years later, obviously 3 or 4 years later, and he loved the idea. He didn't come up with it, but it was either Bruce or Vince or someone else. He loved the idea as soon as he heard it for Kane to be his brother because they looked alike, they had similar sizes, it just made sense. So he called it perfect. He called it the perfect story. So they then transition to WrestleMania 14, and they bring up how Shawn Michaels wasn't in the best of places by WrestleMania 14. He walked into that WrestleMania as the WWE champion. There was a fear among the boys in the back that he wasn't going to do business that night for Stone Cold. And the reason they talk about this was because Taker has a big part of this story here, is that Taker had his match with Kane that night. He was happy with the match with Kane. But Taker promised that if the belt did not get switched from Shawn to Steve Austin, that there could be consequences. He even said here that and who knows if this would have ever actually happened, but if Shawn went into business for himself, Taker would have gone out there. And again, this is right after the Montreal Screwjob, so you never know. But had he refused to do the job, he may have gone out there himself and roughed up Shawn until he dropped the belt, which is crazy to think about for a main event of WrestleMania. But he had to ensure that championship had a change hands. It just had to. It was the right story. Shawn was hurt. They didn't know if he would be gone for a month or 2, 6 months. He didn't care for Shawn Michaels early on, but he loves him now, and he's close with him now, and he feels bad about telling that story, but it was Stone Cold's time. There were too many variables there with Shawn Michaels. He may not have returned, and obviously he didn't for 4.5 fucking years. They needed a definitive champion, and they got that in Stone Cold Steve Austin. They talk about the Montreal Screwjob and how Taker told Vince right after it happened that he had to talk to Brett. You got to go fucking talk to Brett because I'm not dealing with this shit. Because obviously by that point, he was already a locker room leader. And they don't really go into much details about it. But he asks Vince at that point, why didn't you just come to him? You know, when you had this issue with Brett and whatnot, why not just come to him and talk to him about it and tell him about it before it actually happened? So I thought that was interesting. They talk about the BSK, the backstage crew, and how there was nothing political about it, according to Taker. He misses Yokozuna a lot, and he praises Yokozuna every chance he gets. Godfather, obviously, Charles Wright, who's a part of the group, he was at Survivor Series on Sunday. And I think every member of the BSK was at Survivor Series except for Yokozuna, obviously, who passed away 20 years ago. But he met Godfather in the ring in Memphis years ago. He recalls hitting him in the ring with a chair. I think he hit Godfather with a chair, I believe. And how he was worried that he was really going to beat the shit out of him there for a second, that Godfather was going to beat the crap out of him. He was going hard on him for a moment. And he preferred to do it the easy way, Taker said. Taker preferred to do it the easy way, and he told that. And Godfather was like, okay, fine, whatever. And they've been really, really close friends ever since. He thought he was going to kill him. He thought Godfather, there was a chance he was going to kill him or vice versa. And they've been friends ever since, thankfully. They traded his Rolex back and forth around 20 times, he would say. They talk about Wrestler's Court and how Dutch Mantel was the one who set it up, the former Zeb Coulter. And it became bigger in WWE. It was the thing pre-WWE. It became bigger in the company itself than when he eventually joined. And how he ended up as the judge because he was the closest with everyone involved. And how he was also the most tenured, so that's how he ended up in that role. JBL was always over the top with those type of things, he said, and how he shared this story about Teddy Long and Mae Young and how Teddy Long was in possession of these blue diamonds, which was Viagra, and they didn't say that until later on, but Teddy was selling this stuff to the boys, but he didn't pay for them originally, so he would sell them without paying for them, and they clarify it was Viagra, and Taker said he should not have been making a profit off of it because he wasn't taking bumps, and Mae Young was a witness. So Mae was asking, why would you guys need Niagara? And that's what he said, that's what Mae Young called it, Niagara. And they were like, no, Mae Young, it's Viagra. And she goes, no, it's Niagara, which was funny. So he was found guilty. I thought that was a great story. So really, Wrestler's Court was a way to handle a situation, Taker said, before it got out of control. As silly as it was a way to kind of calm a situation down before it got out of control, which makes sense. He tells a story about challenging Ric Flair, or rather Flair challenging him to a drinking contest, because no one can drink like Ric Flair. And it was on a long flight, and Taker actually technically won because he put Flair to sleep with how much Ric Flair drank. And that's something he thinks of as a badge of honor, which I thought was funny. So they then get into UFC 121, which I thought was really interesting because, to be completely honest with you, I totally forgot about this. I mean, this happened over a decade ago. I remember when it happened. I remember freaking out, thinking, holy shit, Brock's coming back to the company. So basically what happened was this. 10 years ago at UFC 121, I remember specifically it was like October 24th or 5th, one of those 2 days. Pretty sure it was October 23rd, maybe. Maybe that's what it was. It was the day before a bragging rights pay-per-view. Remember that pay-per-view? Now we have Survivor Series, which is equally meaningless, but 10 years ago we had bragging rights. And I remember this because bragging rights was in Minneapolis, which is where Brock Lesnar was always built from in WWE. Minneapolis, Minnesota, okay? And Taker had a match on that show against Kane. It was the casket match, I believe. Him and Kane in a casket match for the World Heavyweight Championship. I'm thinking, holy shit, they're filming this angle at UFC 21. And at that point, Brock was still with the UFC. He was the champion, I believe, going into that show, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure he was the champion. He lost the title. A lot of people did not expect him to lose to Cain Velasquez, but he did. Because he won over the summer, and then he lost this match pretty decisively. He lost this fight pretty decisively. And then I'm thinking, holy fuck, because Lesnar lost. Taker's in the crowd, completely out of character. We talked earlier, Taker's not out of character often. He was out of character at that show. Obviously, he told Ariel Helwani, a young Ariel Helwani, it's personal between me and Brock. Clearly they're friends. Obviously they're friends. They go way back to 2002 when they first feuded in WWE. Lesnar loses. They shoot this little mini angle where Lesnar walks by and Taker goes, you want to go? You want to go? And then Lesnar just says nothing, looks at him, and just keeps walking. And he was with like his entourage and whatever, with the security guards. They did it on purpose. It wasn't a shoot. It was a shoot, but it was more of a work than a shoot. Lesnar knew he was going to be there. Taker clarified the whole story here, and I'm glad he brought this up. And he probably has already talked about this before, but I don't really remember reading many interviews where he talked about it. So it was done intentionally. He was there to pick a fight. He was there to start buzz. And, Lesnar was obviously never going to show up at bragging rights the next night in his hometown, which would have been sick. But he didn't say it here, but I thought at one point, Lesnar did not leave the UFC until late 2011. And Taker did this with the idea that Lesnar, I guess it either told him or was of the mindset that he did not have many fights left in him. So he's thinking, okay. Lesnar went out of his way to walk by Taker, by the way. That's what he said here. That Taker was trying to position himself as one of his first opponents back in WWE if and when Brock came back to the company. It's just the shame, Taker says, that it took so long to get that match. We didn't get it until WrestleMania 30, which was at that point 3.5 years later, which is way too long. They didn't even acknowledge it. Like, again, by the time WrestleMania 30 came around, I don't think many people were thinking about that at all. I mean, the time had passed. The time to do it would have been WrestleMania 27. I don't know if that was ever a legit thought, because they were a couple of opponents they were pitching for WrestleMania 27. Obviously, it ended up being Triple H, but I think at one point a legit plan was Wade Barrett, who they were building up. Wade Barrett, instead of Brock Lesnar, actually helped Kane bury Taker at Bragging Rights 2010. So clearly they were setting up some sort of story between Taker and the Nexus, or just Taker and Barrett at some point. They never touched again after that, I don't think. That we never got that match, which was probably for the better and may not have been that good. Barrett was never going to break the streak, obviously. He was just there as a filler opponent. The Barrett push cooled off considerably from October of 2010 through April of 2011. But I could have sworn at one point, maybe this was just, dirt sheet bullshit, that Vince wanted to work out a deal with Dana White, the head of UFC, for Brock to come in and work a match, which obviously Brock wasn't going to win. I mean, obviously he did at WrestleMania 30, but he was not going to win if he was not actual under contract of the company in 2011. It just wasn't going to happen. I think people thought Goldberg might come in and face Taker because they were in Atlanta for WrestleMania 27. Obviously, that didn't happen either. We got that match almost a decade later, and it fucking sucked. The Brock matches, some of them weren't that good. Like the WrestleMania 30 one was not good. The other ones were good. The WrestleMania 30 one sucked, but even that was better than Goldberg and Taker, which was a complete shit show at Super Showdown 2019. But anyway, I could have sworn there was talk at the time of Brock coming in to work a match with Taker. Obviously, Taker would have won. And maybe that was the deal breaker. Why would Dana White agree to do? I mean, what is he getting in return? Literally nothing. He would have just allowed his champion or one of his top fighters to go in, potentially get hurt, work a top match, and lose. And even though he's a real, a shoot fighter, that makes absolutely no sense. So obviously, it didn't come to fruition, even if there were talks of that happening at the time. But I always thought that was interesting. So again, they're all over the place here. Then they rewatched Taker and Mankind from King of the Ring 98, and I kind of rolled my eyes when I heard that, because I'm like, ugh. I've heard Taker talk about this so many fucking times. I'm just so sick and tired of it. We know the stories. We know his ankle was hurting him. We know that some of the shit didn't actually go down the way that it planned. I mean, it's interesting, don't get me wrong, but some of these stories I feel like I've heard a million fucking times, which I never thought I would say about a guy like The Undertaker, but they did a whole Untold about this 2 years ago. This is just old news at this point, and I guess they didn't cover it in that first podcast. I was shocked. I mean, otherwise, why would they talk about it again? So they must not have. But he recalls throwing off Mankind off the top of the cell, and how for him it was like a near out-of-body experience. That was the closest thing that he had to an out-of-body experience. And Taker didn't want to do it. He thought it was too dangerous. He thought it wasn't necessary. But they did it anyway. I don't know if it was a Vince decision or a Foley decision, I forget. But the second spot where Foley got chokeslammed through the top of the cell down to the ring mat, that was not obviously supposed to happen. He was supposed to get chokeslammed on top. They were supposed to work their way down and have that be it. He was not supposed to go through the top. He thought he might have died. He thought he at least was at the very least paralyzed. When Taker's standing at the top of the cell and the match is over, celebrating, quote unquote, all he's thinking is that he's hoping Foley's not fucking paralyzed. Again, he reiterates he went into the match with a broken ankle, and all he wanted to see when he was on top of that cell was to see Mick move. That was it. Foley knew his wheelhouse and how after the first cell match from less than a year earlier with Shawn, that first ever Hell in the Cell match, which they already talked about earlier in the interview, Foley knew, okay, I am not going to be able to recreate magic with Taker the same way that Taker and Shawn did. How can I make this different? And they did. It worked to his strengths, and he knew he had to make it different and maybe not necessarily better. I mean, that's debatable. I don't think it's better. I think the first Shawn-Taker match is the greatest Hell in the Cell match of all time, personally. But they made it different, and it worked. And then Austin jokes about how he and Kane had to follow that in the main event in the, the First Blood match for the World Championship that Kane won. Kane's first title win will forever be overshadowed by that cell match at King of the Ring 98. No one gives a fuck about Kane winning the world title that night. No one even remembers that. Not many people remember that. He lost the belt the next night anyway. But what people do remember is, that spot, and specifically that just entire match. Specifically that spot with Foley being chucked off the cell. That's all people will ever mostly remember from King of the Ring 1998. So then they rewatch when Taker was burned at Elimination Chamber 2010. And again, I have not heard him do many interviews about this. I know he talked about it on Hot Ones recently. He probably talked about it elsewhere, but I thought this was interesting because I know Jericho went into great detail about it in one of his books years ago. But he mentions here how he got burned during his entrance. And it's a pretty well-known story at this point, but he poured water on his chest this entire time to fucking put down the flames, like his chest was burning. And he had to keep his composure while inside the pod because it was an Elimination Chamber match. And he was the world champion. He was the last person to enter. He was inside that pod for 20 minutes. He had to keep his cool. His skin bubbled up. Oh, just completely gross. So what happened was he told the pyro guy a couple of weeks before the pay-per-view. This is the side of the story that we never heard. This, I don't think Jericho talked about in his book. Taker told the pyro guy a couple weeks before the show, hey, the pyro's a little close. Can you cool it off a little bit? Can you move it away from me or whatever? And the guy said, oh, it just might have been a draft in the arena. It's like, okay, but I think it's a little close, just to give you a heads up. Sure enough, he goes out there. The flames are way too close. Goes right into his face, and then he turns around to avoid it, and then gets burned on the other side. And the guy is literally he's not entirely on fire, but there are pieces of his attire that were on fire. And luckily for him, he went into that match. He was supposed to wear one of his, like sleeveless jackets, the one where it's like buttoned down the middle, that he wore at one of the WrestleManias. I think WrestleMania 29. He was supposed to wear that night, and he only changed his mind right beforehand. And he also poured water on himself right beforehand because he knew he was going to be inside the pod for such a long time. Had he not done either of those things, the burns would have been way worse. He would have been burned up a lot more than he actually was. I mean, it was pretty bad. They showed the footage here from the angle where you can actually see him get burned up, and it's pretty fucking bad. Like, he's trying to keep in character, and, his sleeve was on fire, his hat was on fire. It was bad. And it could have been way worse, he said. And Jericho said this too, but when Taker was in the pod and they were feeding him water bottles to pour all over himself, he told someone that was over there, he doesn't name who it was or the name of the pyro guy, but he says, when I get to that backstage area after this is over, that pyro guy better be gone because it's not going to be fucking pretty. And that guy, I don't think was ever seen or heard from again. I would love to hear that guy's side of the story. I don't know if he's ever come forward or if he's, I doubt he's a wrestling fan, but we have not heard that story from his point of view, and that was 10 years ago. And sure enough, the guy was gone, never heard or seen again in WWE. So they talk about Paul Bearer for a little bit. And again, they just did the whole documentary on Paul, so there was no real reason to go into great detail about it here. But Paul Bearer had showed up right after him in his WCCW debut, World Class Championship Wrestling debut, when he was Texas Red. And his first match was against Bruiser Brody. I wrote Brody Lee here, which is hilarious. But yeah, Bruiser Brody. And again, they talked about this in the Paul Bearer, the Mortician documentary, which they do rewatch here, by the way. He was only there for 3 weeks before they had nothing for him. But yeah, Bearer ended up being his manager in WWE. He said it was meant to be. And he gave him so much insight on death and burials being a real-life mortician, so it just worked out perfectly. And he just loved the business, and he only ribbed people who he liked. So that's how we knew that Taker was in the good graces of Paul Bearer when he got ribbed by Bill Moody. And then they talk about the last ride and how he thought that Reigns match at WrestleMania 33 would be his last, and he wanted to document it. And, the whole documentary, he doesn't want to say it was cathartic, but it did give people insight on his thinking process during this entire time period. And how he gave people access to parts of his life he had never previously given them access to. And sometimes he forgot the cameras were even there. Like, sometimes the cameras would be filming, and he'd be like, why the fuck are you fucking filming, guys? Like, stop. And he's like, hey, you told us to film. Like, you wanted us to film at all times. He's like, oh, right, I forgot. Because he's so used to, having his guard up, and he needed to let his guard down. So that's eventually what he learned. And, he knew that, these things wouldn't change anything. And he wouldn't change anything but the process. He loved how the documentary came out and how well it came across. But he knew at Royal Rumble 2017, when he was in that Royal Rumble match, he should not have been in the ring that year. He looked fucking terrible. He did not look good in the Rumble. The Roman Reigns match was a disaster. I was there for it. It was fucking terrible. And no one, during that entire process of filming this thing, when he was going to call it a career. I mean, it's not like they said, oh, we're going to have 5 episodes. He'll end his career at WrestleMania 36. No. They had no idea. He may have ended his career with the Roman match if he wanted it that way. He almost ended his fucking career with the when he teamed with Roman at Extreme Rules last year against Shane and Drew in that great tag team match. No one knew when he was going to call it a career. Pre-COVID, he trained for what he thought was going to be his last match ever against the best in the business. And that's what he called AJ Styles. He called AJ Styles the best in the business right now. And I would love to know, I wish Stone Cold had asked him, this isn't a big deal, this is just kind of a gripe, a minor gripe on my part. I wish Stone Cold asked him, well, why do you think he's the best in the business? When did you get wind of AJ Styles? Like, did you hear about him when he first came to the company in 2016, loved his work, and you thought to yourself, I want to work with that guy? I know he talked a little bit about AJ during the last ride. What, was it the Rumble? I think it was the Rumble in 2017 when he faced John Cena, and he was like, or no, maybe it was the Rumble. No, it was Rumble 2018. He faced like Kevin Owens and Sammy that night. And he's like, man, I really want to work with that guy. Like, was that the first time he had heard of AJ, or had he heard or seen his work in New Japan or TNA? Like, I would love to know how far back his admiration for AJ Styles goes. Like, does it only go back to WWE, or is it well beyond that? I would love to know that. So anyway, he was ahead of pace. He was feeling really good physically, better than he had in a long time. But the circumstances changed, the storyline changed, and it really allowed him to bring everything full circle and becoming more of himself and incorporate his wife into it, even though she never appeared in the show, obviously. But they brought up Michelle McCool quite a bit. And during that final promo on Raw, right before WrestleMania, he referenced the Holy Trinity, which people were wondering, oh, what does that mean? And he clarifies here, as he did in the documentary, he was referring to The Undertaker, the American Badass, and Mark Calloway. And it was more Mark Calloway than the other two, but he incorporated all 3 personas in just one match, which was really cool. And the filming went on for hours, a very arduous process. It became difficult for him to move after a while, because it just, given the circumstances, it just wasn't something that he was used to. Stone Cold also brings up how Taker's brother actually passed away the day before the filming, and they touched upon this in the documentary and Last Ride, and I think the final episode. It was just a really sad moment. I mean, now the guy's got to be around a fucking boneyard talking about death and stuff. It's just terrible circumstances. For anyone's brother to die is just terrible. But I mean, he couldn't, I mean, it was also during COVID, so it's not like he could just drop what he was doing and go to his family. He had to call and let his mom know that his brother passed away. Like, he had to be the one to tell his own mom that her kid passed away. Just fucking terrible. Just really, really sad stuff. So AJ called him, I guess after the first episode of this show. Stone Cold took credit for that match kind of happening, how AJ called Taker after watching the Broken Skull sessions. And I think AJ talked about this on the Last Ride, about wanting to work with The Undertaker. And Taker's like, oh, shit, man. Like, I really wanted to call it a career, but fuck. Like, he's the guy that I never worked, that I always wanted to work. And Austin brings up a great question. Was it meant to be to play out the way that it did, with the Boneyard match as opposed to a regular match? And Taker does not say yes. He says it's hard to say whether it was meant to be or not, because that Boneyard match came off so well, but at the same time, he was ahead of schedule. And he was excited to be able to have that match with AJ that people always wanted him to have, that he knew that he was capable of having, that he may not have been able to have that late in his career, but he felt so well physically. It's kind of like WrestleMania 34 with John Cena, it was 34, where they had like a 2-minute match. And he felt better physically that year than any other year. And he was disappointed it was like a 2-minute match, because he could have gone out there. He could have gone out there and fucking, tore the house down. And then you get to WrestleMania 33, he doesn't feel well, and they do the match, and it sucks. It's kind of like the opposite, So anyway, he said that he actually had to spend 3 to 4 weeks in Florida due to the travel restrictions. And he was down there training. He couldn't train after the PC closed due to COVID. So come WrestleMania, after 3 or 4 weeks, he wasn't in as good of a shape come WrestleMania 36 than he was like a month earlier. And he knows now that he can't physically do it at the level that he wants to do it. If it was up to him, he would wrestle forever. But injuries take their toll. And he doesn't want to just live off the spots. He knows that there's 3 or 4 years left in him, because Austin asks him about retiring. And he goes, listen, I could go out there and hit a tombstone every once in a while or chokeslam that guy, but that's not me. I don't want to do that. In my mind, I'm retired. But, Stone Cold even asks, If Vince comes calling, would you consider it? He says never, which gives me a lot of anxiety because I do not want to see Taker come back for one more match. I don't. I think that really should have been at WrestleMania, but he's loyal. He's got a lot of blind loyalty for Vince McMahon. He would never say never if Vince came calling. And Vince, even though he said, oh yeah, it's the final farewell for Taker himself at the fucking pay-per-view on Sunday, come WrestleMania next year through Light on Star Power, he might be calling up Undertaker. I would not put that past him whatsoever. So he said for the first time though in his life, he is okay with the idea of hanging it up and retiring. He has the passion to continue to do it, but he doesn't have the tools. His body won't let him. And obviously this was filmed before Sunday, but Stone Cold brings up, we got the final farewell coming up. How difficult is that going to be for you? And he says, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be tough to say goodbye. But I'm very proud of my fans. I'm very, my fans mean a lot to me to be able to continue to keep me relevant and support me, blah, blah, blah. He's satisfied knowing he can walk away knowing that he did the right things. He did things the right way while he was in wrestling. And he has the respect of his peers, which means a lot to him. And he enjoyed the business that he was in, which is more important, he thinks, than anything else. And then, Austin even said that he got to know Taker better throughout these last 2 episodes, which was cool. Because I guess they were friendly and they talked on the phone sometimes, but they never really had in-depth personal conversations until they did these 2 podcasts, which is cool. And then they quickly recalled Taker putting him on the symbol on that episode of Raw like 20 years ago, like the cross thing. And they talk about that quickly. And then they cheers to a great career for the dead man. So that was the 2-hour podcast. That's the Spark Notes version. I know my review went like, over 40 minutes, but essentially that was the Spark Notes version, the Cliff Notes version of the Undertaker One More Round podcast on the Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin. This is great stuff. I mean, you don't need me to tell you, but it's must listen, must see. You gotta check it out. Fantastic conversation. If you enjoyed the first one, you're bound to like this one even more. If you don't like the whole, I started in the business and blah, 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 we hear that stuff a lot. Some of that stuff isn't all that interesting. When he gets into the real stories about certain things, that's what you want to hear. This episode is for you. I mean, I obviously recommend the first one too, but this one is equally fantastic, if not better. And overall takeaway here, as many other people have picked up on in recent days since this aired on Sunday, he doesn't outright say, I'm never coming back. And listen, even if he fucking did, Shawn Michaels said that how many times and he came back anyway. So listen, I would love for Taker to say, I'm never coming back. But even if he did, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter because the guy might consider another match. And honestly, he very well could. Because you kind of got the feeling here he wanted to go out with a real match in front of real fans as opposed to an empty arena or a cinematic match or computer screens at Survivor Series. I mean, honestly, I know he's going to get inducted into the Hall of Fame one of these days with people there, which is great. But as the final match, he wishes he could have had that one match he knew he was capable of. But he knows his body just can't take it anymore. The time to do it would have been at WrestleMania 36 in front of fans. Maybe the match would have sucked. Honestly, maybe he feels that he was in good shape, but maybe the match would have sucked anyway. We will never know. And then he would have had to go through the whole thing over again where we do another match. And they couldn't have done a cinematic match. I know Matt Hardy did it, but it wasn't the main event of WrestleMania. You can't do that shit at WrestleMania. If you have people in attendance, it just would not work as well. You can't have people pay hundreds of dollars to go to WrestleMania and then watch a fucking screen for a cinematic match for 20 minutes. It just won't work. I don't think. The Roddy Piper and Goldust thing was different. It was a different time. They did it differently. It would not work as well unless it was cut up into different segments. So anyway, if there were people there. But you kind of get the feeling that he wishes he could have had that match at WrestleMania. The window closed. It's over. Maybe he can get back into great shape for WrestleMania 37. I hope he doesn't even try. It's done. Just move on. I don't need to see a Fiend Taker match. AJ and Taker 2 in an actual match would be cool. But it just might be disappointing. It might ruin the legacy of that Boneyard match with that being his final match. So, whatever. I thought this was great, though. Fantastic stuff. Absolutely check it out right now on the WWE Network. Broken Skull Sessions, The Undertaker, One More Round. Check out all my other Broken Skull Sessions reviews right here on the channel. He's done a number of other episodes. In addition to the Taker ones, you got to check out the other ones. He's done ones with Kane, Big Show, Goldberg, Mark Henry, Ric Flair, Jerry Lawler. They had Bret Hart on for an episode, Kurt Angle a couple of weeks ago. That might have been all of them. There might have been one or two more people, but that's a majority of them. And all of them were really, really good. All of them were fantastic. So check them out right now on the WWE Network, and check out my reviews right here on WWE Network and Chill in the description box down below. So we've had a lot of content go up in the last week. If you haven't already checked it out, be sure to check out my Break It Down review featuring The Undertaker, Chronicle review featuring Lana, Ms. and Mrs. reviews. We have Total Bella's reviews, Q&A videos, which is also going up today in the form of hashtag AskGSM, WrestleRant radio excerpts from my interviews with Finn Balor, my interviews with Kevin Owens, Sasha Banks, Bianca Belair, Johnny Gargano, Danny Burch, and so many more. So many more. Seth Rollins, Triple H, so many more interviews right here in the channel that you could check out, Jeff Hardy. So subscribe, like this video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Hit that bell button as well, ring the bell for more daily content and to be notified every time a new video goes up. And take care, guys. Just have a great rest of your week. I'm Graham GSM Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.